This week really has been full of political news, from by-elections, investment deals and shadow fleets, to court decisions, to a social media ban and reforms housing policy. There's loads to talk about. This week's episode of the Roundup by News of the Week will cover all of those stories, answering the biggest questions from them. Those are questions like, will the social media ban actually happen as it's been announced? Has this week cemented Starmer's fate, and whether reform's potential housing policy is actually feasible? This episode will answer all of that and more with fair and balanced analysis in as much detail as I can manage. If you enjoy it, please consider liking, subscribing and leaving a comment. But for now, let's talk about the news. In policy change, to start off with, the government announced a social media ban for under 16s as reported by The Independent. The question is, will the ban actually happen as it's been announced? Starmer announced the ban on Monday. He said his move will give children their childhood back. His policy would see under 16s banned from Snapchat, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, X and YouTube, and there is also talk of consideration of limiting the ability of 16 to 17-year-olds to scroll late at night or access certain content. On the flip side, access to WhatsApp or Signal or gaming and YouTube Kids and Google Classroom is thought to be exempt from the ban. So, while announcing his ban, Starmer compared children trying to dodge it to children trying to get alcohol. In a separate part of his speech, he also emphasised the idea that tech firms will be liable for failure to comply rather than the children themselves. The Independent noted that the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, the NSPCC, the Children's Commissioner, Girl Guiding, Kerry Badenoch and others were in some way in favour of the ban and praised its announcement. The problem is that there are actually several problems with most of that. Firstly, it's been met with concern from tech firms that children could go to less safe and less regulated platforms. It's also been met with negative reactions from children, and there are also political factors that could undermine it. At the moment, the policy is just a commitment. It isn't fully implemented or even fully announced. We don't know how it will work in practice. And that won't change for just under a year, according to what the government has said. A year is enough time for pressure to pile up, trade-offs to be required and legislation, even major prominent legislation, to be watered down or U-turned on. And given the government's current position within its party, it could even be enough time for revolts in votes or a change in leader. Previously, this has happened with a range of legislation throughout Keir Starmer's premiership. It's happened with the two-child benefit cap, with the arguably stealthy taxing of working people, and the U-turning on winter fuel payments and welfare state reforms. Legislation like the Workers' Rights Bill was watered down, and there has been a consistent issue of delays with things like the Defence Investment Plan. So it is a track record of these massive policies being watered down, changed in some way. Arguably, the suggestion that this policy could be personally wanted by Starmer as part of his legacy, given his stance on violence against women and girls and online safety, could further add to the idea that this policy could change yet. That's because legislation like this, which can serve as a legacy thing for Prime Ministers, like May's Brexit deal, Johnson's HS2, Truss's mini-budget and Sunak's Rwanda plan, is often amended, dropped or replaced by their successors, even from the same party. Furthermore, this announcement goes further than it was initially suggested it would go, with reports from literally a week and a half ago suggesting it would be a limited ban focused on securing the benefits of social media while making it safer. That's been a point in the media and a prominent part of the consultation process which would have supported this announcement. However, as I suggested, there is reportedly broad support from parents, organisations and politicians in favour of this sort of ban, and Parliament's legislative process makes it relatively easy for a sitting government to pass legislation when there is that level of broad support. Ultimately, we're not at a point where this ban is unlikely to come through, or whether it's about to be imminently changed, but there is room for it to be changed in the future, given the government's history, Starmer's situation and the logistics of passing legislation like this. Moving on to foreign policy. A deal has been signed, but not one between the EU and the UK. It's a deal between the UK and Japan. In the last year or two, loads of quote-unquote deals have been made, so is this one significant and does it stack up? The start of the BBC's article was that a multi-billion pound investment deal has been agreed, which Keir Starmer has said will build an era of cooperation between the two nations. The deal will reportedly see a £9 billion investment into UK infrastructure and financial services, and up to an extra £9 billion invested into offshore wind. But there were also broader agreements in it. British defence company Rolls-Royce will work with Japan's Atomic Energy Agency, while UK expertise could be shared with Japanese manufacturing firms. While all of that sounds really significant, it isn't clear how much was already pre-planned, pre-agreed and pre-announced, and that makes its significance a little less certain despite the billions of pounds we are about to see in investment. But there are also countries in the world which we aren't about to make deals with, and the Times has covered Britain imposing fresh sanctions on one of them, on Russia, and specifically Russian Shadow Fleet ships. The question here is what the impact of these sanctions and the action around it could be. Well, all of this is going on during a G7 summit at the start of the week, where there were big international topics like Iran and Ukraine all up for discussion. With that in mind, what's actually happened here is a number of vessels in the Shadow Fleet that is targeted has been expanded to more than 650. That means that they could be monitored and even boarded or seized, as has also just happened. One of the crew members on board of the seized ship this week, the Smirtos, I think, have been arrested, and there's now speculation that that oil could be used to support Ukraine directly. So this has massive implications for the current situation in Ukraine and current relations right now. It's all unfolding. Reuters also reported a Russian bank has been sanctioned too, with the aim being to stop Russia from, quote, and the sanctions here on both the ships and the bank suggest this is being done both with logistics and financing. There are sanctions on both the logistics and financing of Russia's military. All of those sanctions and the talks is part of a wider package of support for Ukraine anyway, as a £210 million deal to support the Ukrainian energy production has been agreed, in a reported win for British manufacturing. So where does that leave us? Well, so the expanded sanctions on Russia's ships and their banking firms mean that Russia's ability to escape sanctions is being constrained. The announcements could also directly help Ukraine with the investment in their energy. However, both of those things is quite hard to measure at the moment, and so we'll have to see in a few weeks' time or a few months' time when the effect of this actually comes through. Moving on to general politics. Firstly, for the last few months, one of the biggest developing stories has been that of the Prime Minister's future. For a while, the thing was that no one was moving, and that was even if they supposedly could, because not all of the potential challengers were actually in a position to challenge. Andy Burnham, for example, wasn't in Parliament. This week, that's all changed because of the Makerfield by-election, where Andy Burnham secured 9,231 votes, winning 54% of the vote there. That was 20% more than Reform won, and still substantially higher than Reform and their rival party, Restore Britain, could manage if you put them together. So the question is, if last week could have spelt the beginning of the end for Keir Starmer, as last week's written episode outlined, has this week cemented his fate? Well, The Guardian noted that even before polls closed, Downing Street sources told them that Starmer will fight on, showing his defiance. They then clarified to The Guardian that this would depend on the size of Burnham's win. With that in mind, the numbers I just read out clearly show that the majority was pretty big and that the win was pretty convincing. But what you should also know is Reform were expected to do fairly well in the region after their local election success in the area, so that almost makes the win seem even better and bigger for Burnham. Even if that was to throw Starmer's plans into doubt, one of the most important things that The Guardian touched upon was Starmer's role in all of what happens next. Basically, while he can't block a leadership contest, he can decide whether he wants to fight for his position, and he can decide to step down, as reports today are suggesting he might. So if we look very, very simply, even now, as his position is theoretically the most threatened it has ever been, Starmer has some agency here, and that could really affect how quickly his future and the future of the government is decided. In terms of what's most likely to go and happen, though, there's a few things to consider. There's potential challenges and some of the other factors going on as well. So obviously, Burnham could challenge. At this point, it seems pretty likely that that could happen. Wes Streeting has also been tipped to challenge, and so has Angela Rayner, assuming they both have the numbers. Darren Jones, who some have called Starmer's right-hand man, has also been tipped to stand as a continuity candidate if Starmer himself decides not to run. Whoever runs, as 100 Labour MPs have now called on Starmer to resign, and Starmer himself still seemed resistant, at least at the start of the weekend, that he'll fight on, the most likely outcome seemed like a leadership contest. And that was made more likely by the disagreements on preferences in the camps with different challenges. Burnham's camp has called for an orderly transition, there are others calling for a race, and while some of Starmer's team are calling for loyalty. What's also pretty significant between all of that is that there are various cabinet ministers that have reportedly told Starmer to resign, but at the same time there are those that are in defence of the Prime Minister, and there are some who are already suggesting that Burnham could have to do some work within the party because not many MPs know him. So to sum up, really, there's competing strategies between the people running. There are also competing preferences amongst potential candidates and MPs. But to be fair though, the members are more unified. If it come to a leadership contest, they seem more unified behind Burnham if polling of them is to be believed. With all of that in mind, it might seem like the most likely outcome is a leadership contest, with Burnham winning. But then again, at the time of recording on Sunday morning, there are reports that Starmer could step down and set out a timetable to transition, as more ministers, including the Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper, have told him to resign. In any case, how quickly whatever happens next will happen depends on Starmer, who runs in a contest, and how the next week or so plays out. But regardless of how it plays out, it does at this point seem fitting to say this is Starmer's fate sealed. But we'll see. Anyway, away from the drama and the mess of the Labour Party and the by-election as a whole, ITV News reported that Farage said reform would evict all foreign nationals from social housing. But could this work in practice? Well, ITV News reported on a Substack essay published by the Reform UK leader, titled "Britain is a two-tier state against white people." The post broadly criticised what he sees as unfair treatment of white people in the country. ITV noted he has been compared to Enoch Powell by others following the post, with one of those people being the Lib Dems leader Ed Davey. Enoch Powell is famous in British politics for his Rivers of Blood speech, which is widely condemned for fueling racial tension in the UK. Regardless, what he actually said was housing, healthcare, education, work, the police and the military have all been affected by anti-white racism. Then was his policy revelation, that a reform government would see foreign nationals in social housing have to relocate to private rented accommodation or lose their right to remain and be liable for deportation. It's more than likely that such a policy would be in breach of international law, or namely the ECHR and Article 8, the right to family life. It's been reported that the EU and political leaders have agreed to a changed interpretation. Obviously, the Labour Party are also trying to amend the UK's interpretation of Article 8 and the ECHR, but neither of these changes would allow for measures as harsh and as significant as Farage's idea. His wider rhetoric has the potential to raise moral issues and a degree of backlash. The reforms that Labour are trying to implement, and even the ones that the EU leaders have agreed on politically, are very, very hard to pass, and they face their own questions of feasibility. So the thing is, if those at the moment aren't feasible, despite Labour's parliamentary majority and the EU political agreement, due to judicial issues, backlash, checks and balances, etc., 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 Farage's policy seems even less feasible and even less viable. And you've also got to think that this isn't a manifesto. We're not at a general election, and we're just in the run-up to a by-election which threatens to be quite close. And whether any of that could further reduce the feasibility or credibility of the policy announcement. But away from party policy, because we need to discuss a legal decision, namely that judges have ruled the ban on Palestine action was lawful as reported by The Independent. Let's have a look at what this means for the government. So on the 16th of June, in the Court of Appeal, a 5-judge panel found the previous ruling was wrong. The Court of Appeal agreed with the Home Office's appeal on all of its grounds, and specifically noted that they were unable to identify any alternative steps for the government. They also found that the then Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, balanced the need to safeguard national security and the disruption of people's rights. Liberty, a human rights pressure group, noted the court also found ordinary criminal law was insufficient in dealing with Palestine action, and that the previous ruling did not adequately consider the escalation of Palestine's activity. But you're probably screaming down the phone, tablet, laptop or TV that all of that means nothing to you. So the implications of this for the government is that their court proceedings against the people supporting Palestine action can now go ahead. It also means that Palestine's actions prescription still remains and clarifies in which situations the government can prescribe groups in the future. That's the end of the news I collected this week, so let's quickly zoom out. Firstly, the government has announced a social media ban for under 16s, which on their history and on a few other reasons could be changed in the future. We'll see. In foreign policy news, Britain has expanded sanctions on Russia and a deal has been signed with Japan. The significance of both of those things is at the moment unclear. In policy change, it could be that this week has sealed Starmer's fate, but what exactly will happen next is also unclear given all the moving pieces and all of the potential outcomes. Farage and Reform UK have seemingly announced a policy on housing which doesn't seem very feasible at first glance, and the Court of Appeals has sided with the Home Office, which has allowed them to continue their prescription of Palestine action and go ahead with their court cases. Whew, that was a busy week. Okay, so that's the end of this week's episode of the Roundup by News of the Week. I hope you liked it and found it useful. If you did, please consider liking, subscribing and letting me know what you think in the comments below, because that helps me greatly in making this every single week. Speaking of, I'll be back next week, but in the meantime, if you want to see more of News of the Week's content, head to our social media and newsoftheweek.net, where you can read this episode in its written version and you can see what I'm saying, but it's reading instead of me saying it, and it might be more clear. Also, you can check my sources. That might be a good idea too if you're sceptical about anything I've said. With that in mind, I'll be back next week. I'll see you then. Bye.